Kate Milavalcha, welcome to Irish Granny Helen. It's time for our Saturday book, and we are on video number 3 of the Sirius mystery by Robert Temple, New Scientific Evidence of Alien Contact 5,000 Years Ago. I've heard from a few people that seem to really be enjoying this book. I will say that my synopsis of it doesn't do it justice. It's a very dense book. Having said that, I've gotten in trouble again. They don't approve of synopsizing too much. So moving forward, I will have to tell you the summary of what the author has been saying without betraying too much detail. We will do our best. We'll see what happens. So let's move forward, and the story talks about, we are going to talk about the story of Gilgamesh. And it talks about 50 oarsmen that row a celestial boat from Egypt. Well, at least it wasn't called Egypt in those days. And in Egypt, there are stories of a celestial boat with 50 oarsmen associated with Anubis, the dog god, the dog-headed jackal god. And, the Greeks tell of a story of Jason, who followed the sun, the golden fleece, get it, on a boat with 50 oarsmen, given to him by Hermes, who is associated with Anubis. And I will say this, that it's hard to patch together what the Sumerians knew, because we have fragments, bits and pieces. It took a long time to figure out what the cuneiform was saying to begin with. It's really hard to translate this stuff. But their mythology seems to, this would be Gilgamesh, seems to talk about the children of the earth goddess springing out of the earth. And later on, there are these tales of men springing out of the earth from dragon's teeth, and the goddesses and gods are associated with the symbol of the dragon. I mean, it all kind of ties in. It's really very interesting. So there kind of are striking links between many of these cultures. I would tell you that the story of Noah and his ark, this is a magical boat that repopulates the earth. And this echoes the story of Jason's Argo and the Argonauts. But the story of Noah predates, the story of the Argo predates the story of the Hebrews by a lot. There's another story very similar that goes even farther back. It's an echo of Sumerian tales of a guy called Ziusudra, which is in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So in the Greek myth, which predates the story of Noah, the ark rests on a hill by a sacred grove from which the boat, the Argo, got its wood. So there's this repetition, that I would say there's this repetition of stories, a culture of stories from Egypt, from Greece, from Sumeria, Babylon, from the Akkadians, that just goes from, all these different cultures. They all talk about a flood. They all talk about a magical boat and ark. They all talk about pairs of animals. They all talk about a mountain that it lands on. And you can kind of follow the narrative from place to place. And as I said, there's sort of indications that the story goes back even farther than Sumeria. There is a book called The Common Background of Greek and Hebrew Civilization by Cyrus Gordon. And he would talk about that, but I haven't read that book. There's a repetition of the number 50, which is interesting. I like to think about the commonalities that go on. 50 great Greek heroes rise up from the teeth, the dragon teeth that Jason sewed, 50 companions of Gilgamesh, 50 Anunnaki. So why 50? Why would all these different stories repeat the number 50? And it's sort of been figured out that these mythologies are not just entertaining stories, that they are repositories of scientific knowledge. The 50 has got to do with the stars. There are linguistic ties between the ancient names of gods that connect the gods of Egypt and Sumeria. The story in Gilgamesh of Gilgamesh and Aga. Aga in Egyptian is Anubis. Weird, huh? There are a lot of connections. There are just too many to ignore, really. Gilgamesh cuts down a cedar tree. The god of cedar is described as a monster in the sky, related to a planet, related to Mercury. And interestingly enough, okay, that's Sumerian, but interestingly enough, in Egypt, the word for cedar also means Mercury. It's weird. So there are a lot of translations, but you know, if you want to stick them all together, you can come to the conclusion that this is reference to a star that's the essence of Anu, the seed of the Anunnaki. It's in the area of the 50 heroes. Who are they? The Argo, the constellation. They come from a star that's super heavy. Sumerians believed in the importance of humanity, of a very heavy star associated with the number 50. They talk about the daughter of Anu. The Anu is the bow star that rises. What rises in the sky? It refers to Sirius, which he's already shown. I mean, in Gilgamesh, they've already shown them to be called the bow star, the dog star, related to the Anunnaki, related to the Anunnaki, related to Anu. It just goes on and on and on. It's really remarkable. In Egypt, the daughters of the sky god Isis, and in Sumer, the Anunnaki were the daughters of An, related to the bow star, and these stories overlap. It's hard to not get confused to read these ancient myths and realize that they're all telling the same story in a slightly different way. Given what we do know about Sumerians that mirror Egyptian myths, you can kind of extrapolate that they're not out of line and they're agreeing with each other. And both cultures have very significant importance, emphasizing 7 gods, 10 days of the week, 70 days. Why is that important? Well, it's the periodicity of the star Sirius B. This particular construct in this star, these time periods, the 70-day repetition, is the foundation of Egyptian religion. And it's prominent in Greek mythology. And it's believed by the Sumerians. They still call this the Sothic calendar. Sothic means Sirius. The beginning of their year was the moment of heliacal rising of Sirius, where it rises with the sun. And this coincides with the Nile flood. And they even sometimes call the Nile Sirius. And this was an occasion for a big feast to mark the first appearance of Sirius in the sky. And during the 70 days that it took for it to go back, it was said to be in Duat, the underworld. And its mummy had come alive, and Sirius is reborn, and then it's considered dead. I mean, just, yeah, interesting. It's the Egyptian prototype of the underworld experience. And then that's the time they allowed it for embalming. These repeats of 10 days, the 7 Anunnaki singled out in the Gilgamesh. Before the Spanish conquest, the Aztecs believed that the underworld had 7 caves. Sumerian story of King Etana, that right after the flood, he had to go to the Anunnaki in the sky for fertility treatments in order to have a son. There's a story about the descent of Ishtar to the netherworld, which has 7 gates to 7 caves. It talks about the Anunnaki, 7 Anunnaki on thrones. It's just another link between Sumerian and Egyptian astronomy. Later in Babylon, Marduk took central position in the pantheon. He usurped all the other gods, but they gave him 50 names. And each name is a Kabbalistic symbol. Sumerians like to refer to gods with names using Asar. Asar was their version of Osiris. And then An, that fragment, is used in all of these pantheons. Asari was a form of Osiris that was worshipped in Lower Egypt. So there's all these linguistic connections. It's very interesting. The Egyptian Asar Atu, the Sumer Asar Ludu. It's just, and if we knew how to pronounce them, we'd realize that the only difference between these two names for gods, one from Sumer, one from Egypt, is just the pronunciation is the only difference. And in both cases, the gods are connected with the cultivation of plants. And there's a god Tutu in both cultures. So there's this increasingly complex weave of common patterns in Egypt and early Sumer, and both linguistically and in religion and astronomy. These similarities abound. So we should talk about the dog star, the hound of hell. Sirius is the dog star. Bau is the dog-headed goddess in Sumer. It's Bao, it's where we get bow wow, literally. And she is the daughter of An, A-N, as in Anubis. In Egypt, the dog god is Anubis, or really how it was written is Anpu. The 50 Anunnaki were the children of An. Bao is his daughter and is connected to the dog star. She's equivalent to Isis as Sothis, Sirius. Lots of different ways of looking at their religious terminology, but it all ties together. And this goddess is also jackal-headed, dog-headed. In Sumer, her husband is Ninurta, the son of Enlil. He had usurped An. In Greek myths, the same pattern exists, and they believe that the Greeks just had different names for them, but it's the same story. Uranus is replaced by Cronus, is replaced by Zeus. Enlil in Sumer is associated with the home in the stars. There's a hymn that makes a reference to a lifted light that scans the land. And if we remember, the Dogons believed in a ray that came from the Sirius constellation and like a ray beam, a laser beam, hit the ground and scoured the ground looking at things. The Sumerians, in their artwork, represented the night sky, and in their poetry as lapis lazuli. It's dark blue like a night sky. And Sumer refers to Enlil as home in the lapis lazuli, the night sky. And the Egyptian hieroglyph for Osiris is a throne with a big eye above it. So they really all believed somehow that there were big eyes watching from the sky, is the point that this mythology would be making. And they make it clear that the ray that they're talking about doesn't come from the sunlight, but it comes from a farther star. Josephus from the 1st century talks about ancient knowledge of Hermeticism that's preserved from before the cataclysm in the stone of the pyramids in Egypt and the brick of the ziggurats in Sumer. To preserve the wisdom of the heavenly bodies and their order and their invention. So once again, these cultures are so linked. It makes it very interesting to know that there's this common, is it a common origin that they share? Or are they is one derived from the other? There's reason to believe it's a common origin that they share. Josephus directly links them. And then there's a connection with Jason. And then there's that strange land of Colchis. Through the Hellespont. Remember, Helle fell into the water. And going to the Black Sea, it's in the border of Turkey near Georgia. It's Colchis. Maybe it's Colchis. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. But significantly, it's right by Mount Ararat, where Noah landed. People in the area, it's the Caucasians, they do live to be very, very old. And they have a very distinct culture. It's unlike anything else. And the big question is, why were the Greeks so interested in this place? So it's kind of a complicated little myth that Jason and the Argonauts were all descendants of Minyas. And Minyas was the great-grandson of Phrixus. And Phrixus had 4 sons who lived in Colchis. His sister was Helle, who fell in the water, named the Hellespont. They'd fled. There'd been a war or something, and they fled and landed. They fled on the back of a golden ram. Remember, she fell off. The golden ram was the gift of Anubis. When he got there anyway, they gave the fleece to the king of Colchis, in exchange to allow them to live there. And Phrixus married the king's daughter. So his sons were half Greek. That's why the Greeks were so interested in this area. On his deathbed, he told them, go back to Greece and claim your birthright, where he'd been king in Greece. So his sons took off for Greece, and then they got shipwrecked, and they were saved by the 50 Argonauts. And turns out the Argonauts were actually their cousins, and they'd seen on their way to Colchis to get back the Golden Fleece. They'd been on their way to Colchis to get back the Golden Fleece. So they kind of encountered each other going in opposite directions. 2 of the 50 of the Argonauts had already been lost. Hylas got taken away by a nymph, and Hercules went off to do his ordeals, And so the brothers helped to restore the number 50 because, they were down to 48, and then there were 4 brothers, and so they had a couple extra. In Herodotus is a historian. He claimed that the Colchians were of Egyptian descent from an Egyptian army of Ramses III. And it's weird because the people who live in that area kind of look a little Egyptian. And they do some ritual things like Egyptians, like circumcision. And in ancient times, only the Egyptians practiced circumcision. uh, Eventually, the Ethiopians did too. Nobody knows for sure. Did it start in Ethiopia and go up, or did it start in Colchis and go down? Did it start in Egypt? And, nobody's sure. They also have weird linen weaving patterns, different from anywhere else in the world. Also, their languages are similar. We're still talking about the Colchis and Egypt. Cultural similarities. Various heroes and myths, including the 50 Argonauts. But they're also cousins, so that's significant. Dodona was the place of the oracle. You don't hear about it much, or eventually it wasn't talked about as much as the Delphi oracle. But superimposing the constellation map on the land, you find out that all these oracles actually connect and correspond to stars in the sky. It's really weird. It's like they put that map down on the ground and then they built these oracle centers, these temples. So Delphi was later the most important talked about temple and oracle. And the Anunnaki had their companions. There were 50. They sailed in a magic boat. The Egyptians referred to this magic boat. So we can look back, at these different stories to the earliest versions of the Argo. And it goes back far. The Colchians early on were described as dark like the Egyptians, who lived in 1300 BC. And they coincide with speculation about the dates of the stories in Egypt and Sumer. The capital city of Colchis has never been looked for. The archaeologists have never bothered to look. It's AEA is the name of it. And it might provide some confirmation that these myths were more than just myths. It was a very famous place for ancient metalworking. After the decline of the Minoan culture following the volcano Thera, their hegemony on the sea diminished. That was earth-shattering. And other people took to the ocean and to voyage and to trade, and they got more power on the ocean. And they were able to exploit other places where they stopped. And they took with them the distinct beliefs of Egypt and Sumer. So there's cultural cross-fertilization, and that's always hard to parse out. Robert Graves talked about it. For example, Circe. I'm going to say Circe. I don't think it's really a correct pronunciation. It should be Kirke, but we'll call it Circe. She was falcon-headed, like Horus, the god Horus. She was the death goddess of the Colchis. Jason is said to have offered a sacrifice to Hecate. Hecate was a form of Sirius, Solstice, and he was supposed to have done this sacrifice at Colchis. The cemetery in the myth in Colchis is said to be full of Egyptian symbols. Circe lived on an island she lived in an island called AEA, like the capital city of Colchis, but this was different. And she's said to be the sister of the king of Colchis. So how remarkable he would end up, his son, so her nephew would end up there and name it after her. Her father was Helios, the god of the sun. Also the father of Horus, who had a falcon head, like Circe, was the sun. And the word origin for Circe comes from the word for falcon or hawk. In Latin, a circus is based on a circle. A circus was actually a sort of kind of an elliptical racetrack. But it also refers to an unknown stone in the sky, a planet. And it refers to a falcon or a hawk. And in the Rig Veda, the sun is a hawk. It's just all these similarities. In Greek and Roman myths, Artemis Diana hunted down with a bow and arrow and 50 dogs. She went after Actaeon, the man who spied on her in her bath. So here again we have the bow and arrow, the dogs, the number 50, and Sirius. But all of these things are pretty well known, well, accessible in a lot of places. But there is associated a lot of math with this, having to do with solar and lunar months and years and ages and people and positions on the map. We'll just stipulate. There's depths of sophisticated knowledge. I think that's what we learn from this book. There's things to be learned from here. And that's one of them, is that there's this obscure knowledge that's hidden, but it's not hidden to prevent people from knowing it. It's hidden to protect it and preserve it. So a lot of the facets of mythology, features, places, people, things, have numerical significance, and they refer to astronomy and geometry. And I'm now putting all of this into my own words, and so I'm not going to be reading references. So you'll have to take my word for it. Lots of intersections, like the Hounds of Hades. We're talking Cerberus. Cerberus would be the Latin pronunciation. He had 50 heads originally, not just 3, 50 heads. They reduced it to 3 because it was easier to depict in art, actually, is why they did that. And then they could relate it to Hecate, who had 3 heads. And then we're once again talking about Hecate, Sothis, Sirius, and the planets A, B, and C, 3 planets. So there's a message in this mythology that would not be totally clear to us. We have to really work at it to see the connections. But if you were from that time period, it would ring all kinds of bells. There's an interesting link in Colchis to the Golden Fleece. This is really interesting. That was the area of the world where saffron was produced, golden saffron. And meadow saffron, which is a kind of saffron today, is known as a prescription for gout. In those days, it was known as the only prescription that existed for gout. It was used in ancient Egypt. It was used in the Mediterranean. So, in order to cultivate and harvest it, you would have to go from Egypt to, this is like the Caucasus, Turkey, that area, Colchis. And it was a really difficult journey. And it makes sense that rather than go and grow it and harvest it and then leave again, what would happen was the community would grow, would rise up. An Egyptian community would establish itself there. And there are stories of sun worshippers from Egypt moving from Egypt to Turkey, from Turkey to India, and carrying with them saffron plants. In Egyptian mythology, the stars in the Ram constellation are called the Fleece, and Aries was identified with the Golden Fleece. The story that Phrixus, this is the brother of Hellas. She fell in the water. He reached Colchis, and he sacrificed the ram and spread the golden fleece on the ground. And that became the object of the Argonauts' quest. Well, we talking saffron here? Horus, Heru, was the sun god, the falcon god. He presided over the cemetery in Colchis. It's an Egyptian god. Helios, the sun god, stabled his horses there, according to myth. Circe, the falcon, presided there at that cemetery. In Egypt, Hero was the equivalent of Helios, the sun god, in Greek. And it's where we get the word hero. So there's this weird link from Egypt to Colchis to Indian Sanskrit to us, and originally from Sanskrit, heroes were a race, half man, half god. And that's what Egyptians called their god, their pharaohs, were the Heru. So big question here, are we talking about hybrids? Were the pharaohs hybrids? Were the original pharaohs hybrids? Horus and Helios are both known for the rising and setting every day of the sun, right? And there are more linguistic links that we won't go into because I don't want to quote the book. The Egyptian Neb, which means Lord, is related from Sun Lord to the word Heru to the Sumerian Nibiru, which is one of 50 names for Marduk, the god who replaced, oh my God, Enlil, I think, and is considered the Lord of the Sun. So there seems like there's these weird Egyptian connections that join the Greeks and the Sumerians and the Egyptians with names and ideas, concepts, places, and astronomy and mathematics. So there are all these temples, oracle places, scattered around the Middle East, and they're in a pattern, and nobody could figure out why. But there's a reason. If you take a star map of Sirius and you lie it on the ground, these temples all connect the parts of the constellation. So you would have to have advanced understanding of geography and astronomy and measurement. So the centers, they seem connected to the story of the Argo, and they're a clue to the entire system of religious mysteries. This is a way of encoding their beliefs, not to hide them, to preserve them. Remember, a lot of these were pre-literate cultures or barely literate cultures. So these different temples mark the main areas of the religious practice. Dodona was not in a convenient place. It was hard to get to. It was far from what was considered civilization. Why would they plant a temple there? Well, it coincided with star. If you put it all over the surface of the globe, you would be marking important places in the sky. It was actually that particular temple is oriented to the rising of the star of Canopus. The story and the name of a city and a star that are related, they're all related to the pilot of a ship and a star and the steering oar of a ship. And they all share the same word origins, and they alternate names. And the names all are some version of the concept of heavy or weight. And they're referring specifically to a star that is a heavy star. And by the Hindus, they're called the oarsmen of Argus. It's just so bizarre. So there's all these similarities and associations between Hebrew and the Babylonians and the Sumerians and the Egyptians. And there's the talk of the amphibious god, sort of a proto-Noah, a Greek, who landed his ark at Dodona. and released a bird that told him it was safe. Remember the story of the doves released by Noah to see if the water had gone down when he was on Mount Ararat? How did the Jews and the Greeks end up with the exact same myth? So here's an interesting fact. Dodona and Mount Ararat are on the same parallel, the same latitude. Now archaeologists know that the nearby village to Dodona was a major scientific place in the ancient world. And it's interesting because Paul Wallace, his next book that we're going to cover soon, I promise, talks about findings in this area of the world in Turkey and Armenia. This area of the Caucasus between the Near East and Europe had trade communication with both the Near East and Europe, and cross influences. And it was a center for metallurgy, and it had a Near East influence in its work, its metalwork. But it's known that this site is oriented toward the heliacal rising of Sirius and the worship of the star Sirius. They know this from the mythology and big truck going up my street, sorry. They know it from the mythology, they know it from the artwork, they know it from what's been preserved, but nobody's really investigated it. And this is an intriguing connection. If you took a compass and put it on Thebes, it describes an arc through Dodona and the city of Metsamor that is that important site. The amphibious Babylonian god Oannes, he gave knowledge to man, and he's kind of a prototype of Noah. So the Sirius constellation was associated with the Nile and Osiris. And the biggest star became known as the Star of Osiris. But it also describes, there's a song, an ancient song that describes a star that flies south, flying south, disappearing for a while, Sirius B. And the Argo constellation overlaid on a map with the center of the stern at Canopus, you end up marking all these temples with stars. Put the other end at Dodona, because that's where the oak came from for the boat. And the names of both places are derived from the myths of several cultures. For example, originally, Hercules was derived from Gilgamesh's story and later led to the story of Argonauts. Originally, he was not Jason, he was Hercules. If you swing the overlay to point to Metsamora, the city centered near Mount Ararat, you create a right angle. And then you can use geodetics, and this is complicated. There's no way I could even explain it. I would recommend read the book. It's really hard to understand. I could not put it in my own words. So the calculations are difficult to explain, and he goes into these explanations. But essentially, he relates it to music theory. The calculations on the map relate to the 8 notes over an interval of an octave with 5 tones and 2 semitones. So if anyone else is getting a headache from this, I completely understand. This is a lot to digest. But these ancient people who we think were so primitive, they understood all this and they used it. They applied it. They had the same heptatonic, diatonic scale as Greek music of the first millennium and of the Western music we use today. It's a pretty specific mathematical relationship of notes that have to do with physics and vibration. And now we're getting into, quantum physics? I don't know. So this is all found in Sumerian clay tablets. They may not have had great stationery, but they had some big thoughts. Dating back to 1800 BC. And this is all in clay tablets in cuneiform, and it's called the oldest sheet music known to man. So they made a reconstruction of a 3,700-year-old ancient lyre, kind of like a proto-harp, kind of. And they played this music. And you can buy the recording of it. And if you lay a geodetic octave, I couldn't even begin to explain what they're talking about here, but you're translating music into geography, overlaying it on the map, coming up with constellations and musical octaves. So Apollo was the patron of music. He played a lute with 7 strings, and there are 7 vowels in the Greek language, and this all had mystical significance. Therapeutic music was a thing for them. They knew that music had vibration, and they knew that that could do something to your brain and heal your mood. Who knew? They did. Apollo, with Horus, was worshipped as the sun god. So, different strokes for different folks. Some people called him Horus, some people called him Apollo. It all ended up being the same thing. They had a ceremony to the sun at Delphi that included trances induced over steam. What were they steaming? Horus was the falcon god, and Circe, which means ring, was related to this. Now, here's an interesting association. Was Circe meant to be emblematic of the Cyclops that had one ring eye? That's how they described it. All of these weird disassociated characters were actually related and associated with the sun and the solar system. At Delphi, the Argos was related in a ceremony. They had a giant boat that was carried around the temple and shaped like a moon, like a crescent moon. And they called it an umphalos, an umbilicus, the Argo. O-M, an umphalos. Is related to the sacred chants of Delphi. Where else have we heard that? It relates to sacred music, the sacred name of God that had 7 vowels that must not be spoken, and a pious Hindu meditating will not chant Om. It's the name of God. And there's not just one umphalos, there are several. One at Delphi, one at Knossos, one at Delos. The 7 strings, the 7 notes, the 7 vowels, and the octave. Remember that an octave is 8 notes, but it's actually 7 notes and then a repeat of the original. The first and the last note are the same note. Reflect 8 centers, because there's 8 in an octave. 8 centers, they all relate to a complex system evolving astronomical cosmic bodies. There's myth and ancient history and literature and archaeology. All these stories point to all the same stuff and the same place in the stars. Ancient shrines were carefully placed and had nothing to do with trade or convenience or nationality or boundaries. It had to do with their relationship to the star map. And also, they had geographic importance because of that, but they had musical and symbolic and religious and astronomical importance. So much of this is metaphor that would be understood and recognized by the people of the time, but we don't know what they're talking about because we're not familiar with any of this stuff. The Kythera computer. Okay, so they found a shipwreck off the coast of a shrine in Greek. in Greece. And they found this object, and they called it the Antikythera mechanism. And it was basically kind of an early calculator. And it proves that the ancient technology that these people had it's far more advanced than we've been led to believe. They were far more knowledgeable and sophisticated in their understanding of mathematics, science, just music, physics. They just knew so much more than we give them credit for. We underestimate them. These areas, they were very sacred from very early on, as far back as we can even tell. And they all include stories of snake beings that were killing people and the gods replacing them. Athena was said to have been born in at least 2 of these different oracle sites. And Dodona, Delphi, Delos, Kythera, Knossos, Cyprus, they're all linked on a map by degrees of latitude, by superimposing Argos on a map, by octaves, and all are linked to Egypt in tradition, linguistics, archaeology. They're all connected to the cult of the sun, Apollo, Horus, whatever. And there are stories of Hyperboreans, which were people from far away that some think maybe they were the British, using telescopes. They obviously had a sophisticated knowledge of optics, crystals, lenses. They used them. But they still couldn't see Sirius B. It's too small and it's too far away. It took us to the 90s to get to really see it. Herodotus is great. If you ever get the opportunity to read Herodotus's histories, they're just so interesting. He talks about observing sacred gifts packed in straw that arrived in Delos for Apollo, that were being protected from being broken. And they took a circuitous journey that intentionally avoided mountain ranges. Something was hidden in the straw, and nobody knows what it was. It was called the first fruits. Apparently, they were taken on this long journey from the shrine to shrine on a regular basis, and the ancients made a direct connection between 7 planets, 7 notes of the octaves, with Sirius B being the leader of number 8. Each geodetic center was an umphilus, a navel of the world. That's a technical word for umbilicus, umphilus. The technological ability for the ancients to figure out all of this, all these measurements, they're so precise, longitude and latitude. It's crazy to think about it. It's so extremely sophisticated. The Egyptians, I'm just telling you what I learned from this. So interesting. The Egyptians telegraphed information about the stars' positions and the movements to other observers farther along with a system of beacons and flashes. So this was done in North America too with the Native Americans. People are always astounded to hear about this. An old form of communication. At a height, at as far a distance as the human eye can see, they would put beacon fires, and they would have a system of what these fires look like, or maybe how many, or maybe, whatever pattern that they would provide had messages coded. And that way they could pass information on at great distance without having to go anywhere. But it's safe to say that the Egyptians had advanced geodetic and geographic science. And Egypt was ground zero for all of this stuff. Everything relates back to Egypt. For the Jews, the Greeks, the Arabs, all the places of worship, everything were oriented in that direction. The original Jewish center of worship was not Jerusalem. It was Mount, I can't even say this, Gerizim, and it relates back to Egypt. The prime meridian was located at Dodona. large part of the anger of King Tut was because he tried to reestablish a variation of the geodetic system by moving the boundaries and, reestablishing a new capital city. And this screwed everything up and people got mad at him. And the myth of Awanas carrying the basket represents the warp and woof of the longitude and latitude. I can't show you the picture, but if you look at Sumerian artwork, you'll see the king, and he's got what looks like a purse, and it's got a latticework surface, and it's representative of longitude and latitude. It's kind of a reminder to people. The Dogon emphasized the importance of this weaving in the same pattern. So we're looking at a successful worldwide religious network that used carrier pigeons and signal beacons, and you can see them in the artwork. Often people think, oh, we're looking at doves. But the archaeology all over all these sites will show a temple with doves or a temple with pigeons, and it's all about the communication. Herodotus said that they were messenger pigeons. He was there, he saw it. Nobody believed him, but they were messenger pigeons. They were probably used for political manipulation. So what they would do is they would have an agenda and want people to follow it. So they would send these messages via fast carrier pigeon to Delphi or Delos, and they'd get the message and then they'd pretend to see it. Oh, for heaven's sake. Sorry, my phone never rings. Ever, ever. Okay, so. Okay. The Dogon emphasized the importance of it. So we're looking at the successful worldwide religions, and Herodotus said that they were messenger pigeons. No king would ignore an order from the god, and the oracle would say, oh, I got this message from the gods. So the beacon system is mentioned in Aeschylus, in the play Agamemnon. Using the play and the series of mountains was determined in modern times. They were able to take the play and determine this series of mountains. And it's our only source that kind of validates that that's how they did it. It's important to remember the ancients believed as above, so below. Star maps superimposed on geography. They connected everything with sacred harmonics. So it's true that conventional archaeologists don't like any of this because it challenges their orthodoxy. But using the Argos star map with the helms at a starting point and the same measurements, so you make the connection. I'm trying to figure out what's the easiest way to say it. You make the connection to Gilgamesh and Aga, and it describes the same thing. And he, as you know, the story of the Argos, the story of Noah, it's all the same story. People reinterpret the poem as a riddle. And if you interpret it that way, it accurately describes the points that we just talked about in the myths. Translators had a hard time with a lot of this. And this theory kind of makes everything clear. They were so confused about what they were getting at. What were these stories really getting at? This is what it translates to, but it makes no sense. And this theory ties everything together and clears up some unknowns about things like Akhenaten, who was the most controversial and mysterious of the Egyptian rulers. He moved the capital from the geodetic center, and he messed up the map and the relationships with all the other places in the eyes of the people. But he was using this ancient system and reference points, and the places he selected for the new capital was actually the true geodetic center. So he knew more about this system than the people who thought they were preserving the system. And I think that's really significant and really interesting. He was trying to return to pre-dynastic ideas and practices. He was trying to establish conformity to the ancient system. And he also believed that the oracles made use of computing devices. They talk about 36 spokes on a wheel, like a roulette wheel, like an ancient abacus, and that they would use it to calculate angles. What the heck, you know? The numerous arc maps, they all involve messenger birds, and the Egyptian hieroglyphics used two birds facing each other to represent the laying out on the ground of parallels and meridians. I thought that was interesting. So then there's a word that means oak and laurel and palm and cedar and willow and acacia. And each of these centers was associated with one of those trees. And he talks about, the burning bush, you know. Oh, is this what we're referring to, these trees loosely connected? And then there's the symbolism of the black and white acacia, which correspond to Sirius B and Sirius A. Sirius B would be considered black because it's hidden, dark, and Sirius A would be white because it can be seen, bright. So that makes sense. I think we'll stop here because we don't have a whole lot more to go. I don't want to make this too ridiculously long. So I'm going to stop here and we'll talk a little bit about the information that he talks about in the book. I will tell you what I learned. And I hope this is interesting. The book is really full of so many connections and explanations. There's no way that I could give you the full import of it, but this is just a little taste of what I learned, and I hope that you'll get the book and read it. But in the meantime, we'll end here. I'll start the next video, and thank you for listening. Slanga Foil. Slunge.